Barack Obama had traveled many places in the world. He'd walked into rooms where history was made, spoken on stages that shook nations, and met people from every walk of life. But this time, things felt different. It was a cold, gray morning in London, and he was on a quiet trip to the UK after his presidency had ended. There were no grand speeches to give, no major meetings or press conferences. This visit was personal. There were a few public appearances, but most of his time was meant to be calm, reflective. And yet, something completely unexpected happened. During this visit that he would never forget, his team had arranged a short private visit to Buckingham Palace. Not the kind of state-level visit he had done as president, with red carpets and cameras everywhere. This was just a respectful tour, with very limited press and only a few people in attendance. Obama had already seen many royal palaces, met Queen Elizabeth during his time in office, and walked through majestic halls. But something about this visit felt unusual from the start. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the quiet, maybe it was his own state of mind he had been thinking. A lot about legacy, memory, and time lately. As his car pulled up to the palace gates, the familiar security and formality surrounded him. British guards in full uniform stood tall and silent. The palace staff greeted him with warm but controlled smiles, used to receiving world leaders but aware of the quiet weight that royalty carries. Obama walked slowly through the grand entrance, his hands behind his back, his mind wandering as his guide began to talk about the history of the palace walls. He nodded politely, listened, smiled occasionally. But something was pulling at him, a strange feeling that he couldn't quite explain. The palace felt almost too silent. They passed through rooms filled with gold-lined mirrors, chandeliers that hung like frozen stars, and paintings of kings, queens, and generals. Everything looked timeless, untouched by modern worries. But then, something strange happened. They entered a hallway not open to the public, a quieter, lesser-known part of the palace. Only one royal guard stood there, perfectly still. These guards are famous for their discipline. They don't move, they don't blink, they don't speak. That's their job, to be statues of strength and order. But as Obama walked past this particular guard, something happened that surprised everyone. The guard, a tall, serious-looking man with sharp features and a stillness that seemed carved. From stone, moved his eyes slightly. He didn't move his body, just his eyes. They followed Obama for a second, subtle, almost invisible. But Obama noticed. He paused. At first he wasn't sure what he had seen. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he imagined it. But then, something even more unexpected happened. The guard, still not moving his head, spoke, "Sir, hope I'm not out of line." The sound of his voice was quiet but firm. Everyone in the hallway froze. The guide looked shocked. Guards never speak while on duty. Never. Not to anyone, not even to former presidents. It was as if time stopped. Obama turned to look at the guard. Their eyes met. For a long second, neither man spoke. Then softly, Obama said, "Go ahead." It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. He didn't know why, but he wanted to hear what this man had to say. The guard took a breath. He didn't break posture. His hands were still on his rifle. His eyes looked forward again, but his words came from a place that was deeply personal. "I served in Afghanistan, twice, and Iraq once. As part of NATO," the guard said, his voice steady, but holding something beneath the surface pain. "Maybe, or memory." Obama stood still, listening. The guard continued. "There were nights, dark nights, when I thought I wouldn't make it home. Nights where everything around me felt like it was falling apart." Obama's face changed slightly. His expression softened. He had met many soldiers. He knew this kind of voice, the voice of someone who had seen things most people never will. And one night, the guard said, his voice a bit quieter now, "I was in a base hospital. I'd just lost 2 friends. I was done. I was numb. I didn't care if I got out or not." Then I remembered something I'd heard. Obama tilted his head slightly. The guard continued. "I had watched a speech. Yours. I don't even remember where or when, but I remembered the words. You said hope is the quiet persistence of those who refuse to give up. I don't know why those words came into my head at that moment, but they did, and they didn't leave. Silence filled the hallway again. It's a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but full. I repeated that sentence for weeks. Over and over, the guard said, sometimes out loud, sometimes in my head, when I couldn't sleep, when I wanted to scream, when I felt alone. That sentence kept me going. Obama's eyes welled up. The emotion hit him like a wave. He didn't expect this. He didn't come here to be reminded of speeches. But here was a man, a royal guard no less, standing in front of him, quietly confessing that a few words from years ago had helped carry him through the darkest moments of war. And when I came back, the guard added, I struggled. PTSD, panic, guilt. Therapy helped, but not always. Sometimes what helped was just going back to those words. Obama swallowed hard. He took a small step forward. The hallway seemed to shrink. The air was heavy with emotion. No one ever tells you, the guard said, what your words do when you're not in the room. That line broke something in Obama. He looked at the man, truly looked at him, and something in his chest cracked open. He felt tears rising and didn't fight them. He looked down, touched his chest with one hand, and whispered, thank you. It wasn't political. It wasn't about ego or power. It was about connection to men, different lives, different countries. Standing in a palace built for kings, yet all that mattered in that moment were the human feelings they both held in their hearts. Obama nodded again, turned to his aide, and quietly said, I've met royalty, presidents, generals, but I've never heard anything like that. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. The moment passed, and the tour continued. Something had changed. The palace didn't feel so silent anymore. It felt alive with emotion, with memory, with meaning. That day, Barack Obama came to Buckingham Palace thinking it would be just another formal stop on a quiet trip. But instead he left with something far deeper, a reminder that sometimes our smallest words carry the biggest weight. And sometimes, the strongest people, the ones who stand still and silent, are the ones holding the heaviest stories. What made the moment unforgettable wasn't the shock of a guard breaking silence. It was the honesty, the truth, the deep, unexpected connection between two men who had never met before, but whose lives had quietly touched through the echo of a single sentence. Obama would carry that moment with him long after the cameras stopped, flashing long after the speeches ended, and long after he left the world of politics behind. Because that day, in a quiet hallway, in a royal palace, he was reminded that hope, the very thing he had tried to share, had come back to find him, and that changed everything. The silence after the guard's words still lingered as Barack Obama stood there, trying to absorb what had just happened. Everyone else in the room was still frozen, his aides, the palace guide, even another distant guard who had turned his head slightly, breaking his own discipline without even realizing it. Something very rare had just taken place in that quiet royal hallway, a moment of raw honesty, emotion, and connection between two strangers. Obama took a slow breath, his heart. It was still heavy, not with sorrow, but with something deeper, something spiritual, something impossible to name, but impossible to forget. The guard, whose voice had just broken protocol, stood motionless again, like nothing had happened. But inside, both men knew everything had changed in that brief conversation. As they began to walk forward, Koba found himself distracted. He wasn't listening to the guide anymore. Not really. He nodded politely, answered a few questions, smiled at the staff, but his mind kept going back to that guard. That single sentence, and that sentence he himself had spoken years ago that somehow saved someone across the world. He whispered to himself, almost like trying to hold on to the moment before it disappeared. Hope is the quiet persistence of those who refuse to give up. He remembered writing that speech years ago during his presidency. At the time, he had been talking to students, trying to give them courage, trying to tell them to keep working hard even when the system felt broken. He never imagined those same words would reach a soldier on a battlefield in Afghanistan, a soldier wearing another country's uniform, fighting under NATO. He never imagined those words would find someone lying in pain, thinking about giving up. Obama stopped for a moment in the grand corridor they had now entered. The chandeliers above glittered like diamonds, and the red carpet underfoot felt thick with history. He turned to one of his staff and quietly said, "Can we pause for a moment?" The team nodded and stepped back. Obama leaned on a wooden railing. Near a tall window, outside it was cloudy, typical London sky, soft gray and full of memory. He stared out in silence. Meanwhile, the Royal Guard, the one who had broken protocol, stood at his post, still and silent. But inside, he felt something too. A strange mixture of fear and peace. He had done something he wasn't supposed to do. He had spoken when he was meant to be silent, and yet it felt right, felt necessary. He thought back to his days in Afghanistan, dust, noise, tension, fear. Could still feel the weight of his gear on his back. Still hear the sounds of distant gunfire at night, the fear that came every time the base went under lockdown. He had written letters he never sent. Letters to his family, to his little brother, to his mother. He had even written a letter to himself once, telling himself not to quit, not to fall apart. But those letters had stayed buried in his notebook, stained by sweat, crumpled by time, until that day in the hospital when he nearly gave up. That was the day he saw a clip on someone's phone, an American speech. He wasn't even paying attention at first, but then the voice caught him, calm, steady, strong. And then came the line, "Hope is the quiet persistence." That was it. Those words stuck to him like armor. They didn't solve everything. They gave him a kind of emotional anchor when everything around him was falling apart. Years later, he joined the Royal Guard. People always asked why he didn't choose an easier post, something less demanding. But he needed structure. He needed silence. He needed something to hold him together. Guard duty gave him purpose. But some days, even while standing still for hours, his mind drifted back to the battlefield, and to those words, and now, years later, here was the man who had spoken them right in front of him. Not behind a podium, not on a screen, but in real life, just feet away. And for some reason, something inside him had told him to speak, to say it. Not for applause, not for drama, just to say thank you. To let the man know that his words had mattered even when he didn't know it. Back inside, Obama had collected himself. He turned to the palisade and asked softly, "Is it possible to speak with that guard after his shift?" The aide looked surprised. "We'll need permission." "Sir, it's very unusual, I understand," Obama said. "But I'd like to try." As they continued the tour, Obama couldn't stop thinking about how many people out there were walking through life carrying invisible stories of pain, struggle, and healing. And how sometimes something as simple as a sentence could give someone the strength to keep going. Later that afternoon, as the tour came to an end, Obama stepped outside with his team. The cold air hit his face, but he welcomed it. The city buzzed in the distance, but the palace stood calm and quiet behind him. That evening they received a message. The palace had agreed. After some discussion with the chain of command, the guard, whose name was Michael, would be allowed a short meeting with Mr. Obama in private. Once his shift was complete, Obama smiled when he heard that. It wasn't for public attention. He didn't want cameras or speeches. He just wanted to say what he hadn't said properly earlier. That night, in a quiet room inside the palace away from the public eye, Michael stood at ease, no longer in full uniform, and Obama entered. They shook hands, firmly, silently. "I didn't get to thank you properly," Obama said. Michael shook his head. "You don't need to thank me, sir." It was the other way around. But Obama looked him in the eyes. "You reminded me why words matter, why leadership matters. We speak into rooms, into microphones, but we don't always know who's listening, or when, or why. Today you reminded me that someone always is." Michael hesitated, then said quietly, "Most people just see a standing guard, but there's a lot behind the stillness." Obama nodded. Still waters run deep. They talked for 10 more minutes. No one else in the room. Just two men, both changed by a sentence and a moment they never expected. When Obama left, He asked one of his team members to make a note. "Find a way to keep in touch with him," he said. Quietly. No press. That moment, shared between a former president and a quiet soldier, never made the headlines. But it stayed in their hearts, and perhaps, somewhere deep inside, it became proof that no matter how far words travel, no matter how long ago they're spoken, they can still land in the right place at the right time and change everything. When Barack Obama returned to his hotel that night, his mind was still filled with the conversation he had with Michael the Royal Guard, who had spoken to him at Buckingham Palace. It wasn't the kind of moment you could just forget. Even though the day was filled with beautiful places, important people, and rich history, nothing came close to the depth of that short exchange. Obama sat alone by the window, cup of tea in his hand, looking at the London skyline. Lights flickered across the city and cars moved below like tiny streams of life. But he wasn't seeing any of that. His thoughts kept returning to Michael. The look in his eyes, the strength in his voice, the pain he had carried hidden behind a royal uniform and military discipline. In that one quiet sentence, "No one ever tells you what your words do when you're not in the room." Obama knew what that meant. Like in public life, leaders say so many things in stages, behind microphones, on television. Some words are carefully written, others are spontaneous, but they are spoken and then they're gone. You never really know how deeply they land or where they might end up. Yet here was a man who had heard those words in a place of pain. They had helped him survive, and that brought Obama back to a familiar thought he had wrestled with many times during his presidency, the quiet burden of responsibility being president wasn't just about making decisions or signing laws. It was about shaping feelings, giving people something to hold on to. And in moments like war, illness, grief, or loneliness, it was often not the policy that stayed with people, it was the words. Obama remembered how, after certain speeches, he would get letters from strangers, veterans, parents, teenagers, teachers, some angry, some thankful, some completely heartbroken. He remembered one letter from a mother who had lost her son to gun violence. She didn't ask for laws. She just wanted to know that someone in power felt her loss. Another letter came from a man who had once considered suicide, but changed his mind after hearing Obama talk about hope during a graduation speech. But no letter, no message had hit him the way Michael's words did that day. He thought about Michael's story more deeply. A soldier who had served in dangerous lands, a man who had lost friends in battle, someone who carried the weight of trauma, guilt, and memory. And yet, instead of hiding from the world, Abikil had chosen to stand tall in one of the most disciplined roles possible. A royal guard, still silent, controlled, but behind all that silence was a heart that had known fear, grief, and healing. Obama imagined what Michael's life must have looked like after the war. Returning home but feeling like a stranger, nights when the noise in his mind wouldn't stop. Walking through busy streets while carrying invisible wounds, trying to live a normal life while his soul was still stuck in moments of the past. Many soldiers feel this. The battlefield leaves deep marks not just on the body, but on the heart. Michael had tried therapy, as he mentioned, but he had also relied on something much more fragile, a sentence Obama had spoken years ago. It's never knowing it would become someone's armor in the middle of a war zone. It made Obama wonder how many others had taken small pieces of his speeches and carried them like talismans. How many people had clung to a phrase, a moment, something that had kept them going when nothing else could. He also thought about something Michael said earlier, that people only saw the stillness, not what was behind it. That was something Obama understood too well. Being president meant always appearing calm, confident, collected even when your heart was breaking, even when you were exhausted, even when you were filled with doubt. You had to look strong. That was the role. But the truth was that leaders are human. They bleed, they worry, they cry too, just not in public, and Michael's story felt like a reflection of that. A man standing in perfect silence, still as a statue but with a storm inside him that no one could see, Obama leaned back and remembered their private meeting. Michael had shared more than just a thank you. He talked in a low voice about a Night in Afghanistan when he had been trapped during an ambush. It was dark, and the team he was with had been hit. The radio wasn't working. Backup was far. And in those moments, when every second felt like the end, he remembered lying down behind a broken wall, blood in his mouth, fear in his chest, and whispering that sentence again and again, "Hope is the quiet persistence of those who refuse to give up." He had said it like a prayer, not to survive, but to not give up inside. He didn't want to die feeling empty. That sentence gave him something to believe in. Even if he didn't know why, and he did survive, barely, but he carried that moment forever. Obama had listened in silence. When Michael finished, there were no big speeches, no emotional speeches back, just a long, honest handshake. 2 hands, 2 stories, 1 connection. Obama now sat in his room, feeling the weight of that moment. He thought of all the soldiers, American, British or otherwise, who had fought for things bigger than themselves. He thought of how many had returned broken, invisible, unheard. And he thought of how words, simple, quiet words, had the power to reach them when nothing else could. He got up, walked over to the table, and began writing in a small notebook. He didn't write much anymore, but tonight he needed to. He wrote, "I used to believe that words were tools. Now I see they are threads. They connect us, often invisibly, sometimes silently. But when they find the right heart, they can pull someone back from the edge." He closed the notebook slowly. He looked outside. Again, the city was still alive with lights and sound, but something in him had changed. The next morning, Obama's team asked him if he wanted to mention the Guard during his upcoming speech at a university event in Oxford. A subtle reference. Nothing political. Obama shook his head. No, that story doesn't belong in headlines. It belongs in hearts. Instead, he told his team to send a small handwritten letter to Michael. It was just a simple thank you, not from a president, but from one man to another. In that letter, he wrote, "Sometimes we lead the world. Sometimes we lead one person. I didn't know I was speaking to you that day, but I'm glad you were listening. I'm glad you made it home." Back at the palace, Michael received the letter quietly. He didn't tell anyone at first. He kept it folded in a drawer near his bedside. On nights when the memories returned, when the dreams were loud and the silence felt too heavy, he would take it out and read it again, not because it came from a former U.S. president, but because it came from someone who had looked him in the eye, seen his pain, and said, "I hear you." For Michael, it wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about being seen, being known, being remembered not just as a soldier or a guard, but as a human being. And for Obama, that moment remained one of the most profound of his life, not because it happened in a palace, but because it reminded him that leadership doesn't always happen in front of crowds. Sometimes it happens in a quiet hallway, between 2 men who never expected their paths to cross. And in that stillness, something powerful was born, not a policy, not a headline, but a moment of truth that would stay with them forever. Barack Obama stood still, just a few feet away from the royal guard named Michael. For a few seconds, he couldn't move, couldn't speak. The moment was heavy, but not in a bad way. It was powerful. His heart felt full, like someone had poured something deep and emotional into it all at once. He had heard stories of pain and healing before, had listened to soldiers, mothers, teachers, even children speak about how something he had said or done had affected their lives. But this was different. This was face to face, eye to eye, with no cameras, no crowds, just a quiet hallway in a royal palace, and 2 people who had unexpectedly changed each other's lives. As Michael finished his story, Barack tried to respond, but his voice caught in his throat. He took a breath, but the words wouldn't come. He felt his eyes burning. He looked down and tried to blink it away, but the emotion was too strong. 1 tear slid down his cheek. He didn't feel embarrassed. He didn't care if people saw. This wasn't about pride. This wasn't about reputation. This was real, pure, human. He slowly walked toward Michael. No guards tried to stop him. No one moved. Everyone understood something sacred was happening. Obama stood in front of the man, looked directly into his eyes, and gently placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. His touch was respectful, full of gratitude. For a moment, neither of them said a word. Then Obama, in a low and quiet voice, said, "That means more to me than you'll ever know." Michael didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat tightened too. For a man who had learned to stay still and silent for hours, who had trained to never show emotion, something inside him shook. But he held steady, standing tall. Obama turned toward his aide and said something that would later be remembered not just by those present, but by those who heard the story later. "I've met heads of state, royalty, soldiers. Never heard anything like that." It was a sentence that stayed in the room long after he spoke it. It wasn't loud, didn't need to be. The power of it came from its honesty. The tour guide, a middle-aged British woman who had worked in the palace for over 2 decades, had tears in her eyes. She had led hundreds of people through those hallskings, presidents, diplomats, celebrities, but this was the first time she saw someone truly stop and feel something so deeply right there. Among the history and tradition, Obama stepped back slowly, gave one final look to Michael, and nodded. Michael gave a slight, respectful bow of his head, as much as his posture would allow, and then the tour continued. But the atmosphere had changed. Where earlier, everything had felt formal and grand, now everything felt human and intimate. The golden frames on the walls, the tall windows, the elegant carpets, they were all still there, but they didn't matter anymore. What mattered now was the invisible feeling that lingered, the sense that something truly meaningful had just happened. After the tour, Obama and his team walked quietly back to the car. No one spoke for a while, and one of his aides said gently, "That was something, sir." Obama nodded. "That was something I'll never forget." Back inside the palace, Michael remained at his post just like before. He didn't smile. He didn't show emotion. But inside, he felt something shift, felt lighter, seen, heard. For so long, he had carried pain quietly, like a heavy bag on his back that no one noticed. But today, for the first time, someone had looked him in the eye and told him that his story mattered. When his shift ended, he walked slowly to the guards' quarters, where they removed their armor and uniforms. He sat on a wooden bench, hands in his lap, and just breathed. Another guard, a friend of his, asked, "Everything all right?" Michael looked at him for a second, then nodded. "Yeah," he said. More than all right. That evening, Obama returned to his hotel. He sat by the window again, like he had done the night before. The city lights blinked outside. His mind replayed the moment again and again. The look in Michael's eyes, the sound of his voice, the feeling of a connection that went beyond politics, beyond nations, beyond uniforms. It was about humanity, about what people go through quietly, and how sometimes just a few words can save a life. He thought about how many people walk through the world every day, carrying silent pain. Soldiers, teachers, parents, janitors, taxi drivers, everyone. People who look fine on the outside but are hurting inside.
Ow.
And how important it is to speak words that heal, words that lift, words that give hope. Obama remembered the exact moment when he wrote that line in the speech years ago. He had been sitting in the White House, preparing for a high school graduation address. He wanted to say something honest, something simple, and the words had come naturally. Hope is the quiet persistence of those who refuse to give up. He hadn't thought it would become important. It was just a small sentence in a long speech. But now, after hearing Michael's story, he realized that even small sentences can be lifelines. The next day, someone from the palace staff told one of Obama's aides that the story might never reach the press, the people who witnessed. Its staff, guards, tour guides would carry it with them for the rest of their lives. It had become something of a legend already among the palace workers. One senior staff member said, "That was the first time I saw someone bring the palace to silence, not with power, but with kindness." Another guard said, "We're trained to never speak. But today, I'm glad one of us did." The story wasn't in any newspaper. No photo of it appeared online. But slowly, quietly, it spread through whispered conversations, anonymous blog posts, and emails shared among staff. One anonymous person wrote about it on a forum for veterans. They described how a royal guard had broken protocol to thank Obama for saving his life with a single sentence. The post ended with, "You never know who your words are reaching. Say good ones." Weeks later, Obama was back in the United States, attending a small event for veterans in Chicago. As he walked through the crowd, a young man approached him and said, "Sir, I'm friends with a guard at Buckingham Palace. He told me what happened. I just wanted to say, thank you for listening." Obama looked at him and said with a smile, "I should be the one thanking him." That moment between Obama and Michael remained one of those rare, sacred human experiences that didn't need headlines. It didn't need to be told to the world. It just needed to be remembered by the hearts that witnessed it, sometimes real. Change doesn't come from speeches or policies. It comes from one person looking at another and saying, "I see you. I hear you. You matter." That's what happened in that hallway. And that's why Barack Obama, a man who had spoken to millions, been cheered by stadiums, and met kings and queens, broke down not because of weakness, but because of something much stronger. Because in a quiet moment, a silent soldier broke his silence and reminded him what leadership truly meant. After that unforgettable day at Buckingham Palace, Barack Obama left London with something heavy in his heart, but it wasn't a burden. It was something beautiful. A moment had happened there that wasn't planned, wasn't rehearsed, and wasn't meant for the world to see. But it had changed him. It had reminded him why words matter, why people matter, and how sometimes a quiet thank you from a stranger means more than a standing ovation from a crowd. The next morning, as his plane flew back toward the United States, Obama sat by the window, staring out at the clouds. His team was working quietly behind him, going over schedules, calls, meetings. But Obama wasn't thinking about his calendar. He was thinking about Michael the Royal Guard, who had spoken from the heart. He wondered what Michael was doing now. Was he still standing tall in those stiff uniforms, holding his post? Thinking about the moment too, Obama's fingers tapped lightly on the armrest. He leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. The guard's words kept echoing. I don't know why those words came into my head, but they didn't leave.
Ow.
Strange, Obama thought. Words that he had spoken years ago, probably forgotten by many, had been the rope that helped a soldier climb out of the darkest hole in his life. That rope had stretched across oceans, across uniforms, across silence. It had pulled one man from the edge, and that man had stood face to face and told him quietly how much it meant. In that moment, Obama had felt seen too. He didn't say it out loud, but being president had not been easy. Yes, there were powerful moments, big changes, and pride. But there were also sleepless nights, criticism, fear of failure, and the loneliness of carrying the weight of a whole nation's hopes. And sometimes, he too, had wondered, did it matter? Was it worth it? Did anything I say really help someone? Or was it just noise? Now, because of Michael, he knew. At least for one man, in one moment, it mattered. That was enough. Weeks passed. Obama returned to his usual routine, gave speeches. He visited communities. He worked with his foundation. But he never told the story publicly. He didn't want to. That moment wasn't for headlines. It wasn't something to brag about or put on television. It was too sacred for that still. He wanted to do something. Not for the world, but for Michael. So quietly, without media or press. The Obama Foundation reached out to the British government. They wanted to invite Michael for a private visit to the United States. No big event. Just a big event. Just a personal gesture. A chance to reconnect. To say thank you. To sit down as two human beings and talk more freely. The request took some time. There were approvals, paperwork, security checks. But eventually it happened. Michael was allowed to travel on a short private leave. When he received the letter of invitation, he stared at it for a long time. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. But he felt something inside him loosen a deep knot he had carried for years. When he arrived in Chicago, one of Obama's personal staff picked him up from the airport. There was no media, no big welcome, just warm handshakes and quiet words. He was taken to a private meeting room inside the Obama Foundation building. Obama was already waiting there, dressed casually, with a calm smile. They shook hands again. This time there was no tension, No uniforms, no crowds. Just two men. Obama gestured to the chairs. "Let's sit," he said. Michael nodded. For the next hour they talked, not like a former president and a soldier, but like two people who had shared something honest. Michael spoke more this time. Up in a small town, he talked about the decision to join the military, the pain of war, the struggle to find purpose after coming home. Obama listened closely, asking questions, not as a leader, but as a man who cared. Then Obama told him something he had never shared before. He said that there were many days during his presidency when he had doubted himself deeply. When things didn't go right, when the country felt divided, when tragedies happened and no words felt enough, there were nights, he said, when I sat alone in the Oval Office, wondering if anything I said actually helped anyone. And then, years later, I met you, and I knew it did. Maybe not for everyone, but for one person. That was enough for me. Michael looked down. He was quiet for a moment. "What?" Then he said, "I didn't expect to say anything that day. I almost stayed quiet. But something told me, if I didn't say it then, I never would." Obama smiled. "And I'm glad you did." After the meeting, they took a quiet walk through a garden near the Foundation's library. No crowds, no speeches. Just walking, talking, and breathing in the fresh air. Later that evening, Michael flew back to the UK. He didn't tell many people about his visit. Only his closest family knew. He returned to duty back in uniform, standing straight and tall. But something had changed. Inside him, he stood not just with pride, but with peace. Back in the US, Obama reflected often on the encounter. He even started a new speech later that year with a quiet phrase, "You never know who is listening." He didn't mention Michael by name, but those who had heard the story knew what he meant. A few months later, someone from the palace no one knows exactly who wrote a short letter to a British newspaper. It was anonymous. The letter didn't mention names or exact details. It just described the scene, a former world leader being brought to tears by a silent guard. Quietly, people began sharing it online. Some thought it was fiction. Others believed it instantly. But it didn't matter. The truth had already done its job. Across forums for veterans, the story became something of a legend. Not just because it was emotional, but because it was real. It reminded soldiers and civilians alike that people carry invisible battles. And that kindness even from a stranger can heal more than medicine. At a high school one day, a student asked Obama during a Q&A session, "What was one moment after your presidency that really made you feel proud?" Obama paused. Then he said, "There was a moment in a quiet hallway, far from cameras, when someone told me that something I said once helped them survive. That's a feeling no award, no title, no honor can ever match." That was all he said. But those who had followed the story knew exactly what he meant. Years later, when Michael retired from service, he gave a small private talk to a group of new recruits. He told them about discipline, about pride in the uniform, about standing still with dignity. And then he said something that stayed with all of them. Never assume your silence means you're invisible. Never believe that your story doesn't matter. Sometimes one sentence you heard long ago can carry you through everything. In the end, the world never saw a photo. There was no interview, no formal statement, no spotlight. But the story lived on in hearts. A moment between two men, one, a former president, the other a quiet soldier, taught us all something timeless. That words, when spoken with truth, never disappear. That kindness leaves echoes. That hope, once given, can return years later, in the most unexpected way. And that sometimes, the most powerful moments in history are not the ones we see, but the ones we feel.